Olá, boa tarde e bem-vindos à Culturgest. Welcome to today's debate. A few years ago, we opened a new moment in the life of Culturgest with a talk by Professor Achille Mbembe named For a World Without Borders. This was a trigger for a political imagination prompted by the consciousness that the subject of migration, forced or not, is one of the main subjects of our present times. The idea of a world without borders seems now even more an utopia. Borders of different types and qualities have been more and more present in our life. In the beginning of the pandemics, the experience of those who find themselves forced to displacement and to cross them was somehow put in a second plan in the public sphere of debate. But events and things like the fire at Morya refugee camp or the death of a migrant worker at the hands of members of the Portuguese police who was in charge of the protection of borders, as well as the news of persons that keep crossing the seas towards Europe, shows the necessity of keeping this subject in sight and of addressing it. So today's talk will address the subject of migration, underlying a specific dimension that of the traces of those travels and of the traces of hospitality. First of all, I would like to thank and to briefly present our speakers today. I will start by Rui Gomes Coelho, who is assistant professor at Durham University in the United Kingdom and member of UNIARQ, the Centre for Archaeology at the University of Lisbon. As an historical archaeologist, Rui has been collaborating with archaeological projects based in the United States, in Portugal, Brazil, Germany, Spain, Croatia, and Guinea-Bissau. The Garden of Refugees, in the volume The New Nomadic Age, Arqueologies of Forced and Undocumented Migration, edited by Yannis Hamilakis in 2018, and the article An Archaeology of Decolonization, Imperial Intimacies in Contemporary Lisbon, published by the Journal of Social Archaeology in last year, are two of his last published essays. I must acknowledge that the idea of this debate came from a conversation with Rui, who is researching for a long time on the subject of his hospitality. In fact, hospitality, sorry, I'm sorry. In fact, the general title of the encounter today borrows the title of his talk, Arqueologies of Hospitality. We have also with us Rachael Kiddey, a British Academy postdoctoral researcher at the School of Archaeology in the University of Oxford with a project named Migrant Materialities. She holds a PhD by the Department of Archaeology in the University of York, and her doctoral research involved developing methodologies for working archaeologically with homeless people. There is a dimension that perhaps we'll have the time to explore this in the debate, a dimension of activism in her work, but I think that in the work of all our invited speakers today, so a deep involvement with what's happening also with the space outside academy, with the concrete experiences. The work that she developed for her PhD is published in a monograph named Homeless Heritage, published in 3 years ago by Oxford University Press. And this book won the Society of Historical Archaeologists James Dietz Book Award in 2019. The talk today today Rachael will give a talk with the title "What People Take with Them and Why: An Activist Archaeological Approach to the Material Culture of Forced Displacement in Europe." And finally, we have also with us Yannis Hamilakis, who has been working in Lesbos in Greece since 2016, exploring and recording the material traces of border crossings. Yannis is professor of archaeology and modern Greek studies at Brown University in the United States. His main research interests are the politics of archaeology and heritage, archaeological ethnography, experience and sensoriality, the archaeology of Greece, and the archaeology of contemporary migration. Yannis has several publications on those subjects, and I will just mention his last edited book, The New Nomadic Age, Archaeologies of Forced and Undocumented Migration, published by Equinox in 2019. The title of his intervention today will be The Return of the Colonized, an Activist Archaeology for the New Nomadic Age. You can find more information about our invited speakers, and also the abstracts in our webpage, so I don't want to make it too long. This is just a short presentation. And in our website, you may also find a micro site with more information about this subject, and also 4 different links for organizations who work very closely with migrant people. Those organizations are No Name Kitchen, CORA, the Athens-based Refugee Support Group, Refocus Media Labs, Wave of Hope for the Future, and we invite you to visit them in order to know their work better, and also we welcome if you can and if you want to give your contribution for the work of those organizations. I will now, after this short presentation, I will now give this virtual stage to our speakers, starting by Rui Gomes Coelho, and I would also like to thank you all again for being here today with us. And I will be back again in the end of your presentations in order to moderate the debate and also invite the people that are following this meeting at their homes to intervene and put their comments and their questions in through Facebook and YouTube chat. So Rui, thank you and welcome. You can now start.
Thank you, Liliana. It is really a great pleasure to be here tonight with you and with Rachael and Yannis. They are people who have inspired me a lot throughout my education and my experience as an early scholar. Either the things they write and the way they work and the way they present their work to the world and they engage with the communities they work with. So many of you watching us tonight might be still wondering if archaeology can anyhow engage in a productive way with the crisis that is unfolding quite straightforwardly in front of our eyes. Is there anything we can find in the past in materiality that help us to make sense of the horrors described by people who live them, sometimes on live TV? I believe that the answer is no. It is impossible to represent those experiences, and I question the ethics of documenting those experiences archaeologically. As you will see tonight, the point of archaeology in the current humanitarian crisis is not to turn migrants and refugees into research objects. Archaeology can be a way to investigate the circumstances in which the humanitarian crisis emerged and to inform critical speculation about how different things could have been, how different they can be. There was nothing inevitable about history, nor in the current state of affairs, but there are events, experiences, and choices that lead us to the present configuration. Archaeology is helpful because it may disclose the expectations and the possibilities that people faced in any given moment. But not only that. Archaeology is a process through which we encounter different people, dead and alive, a process through which we learn about their stories, spoken and unspoken. And because it is always a collective effort, archaeology is a practice that generates conditions for archaeologists and even communities to ask and sort things out together. My involvement in this conversation started a few years ago when I was working with a group of colleagues in the northwest of Iberia, a region that was divided by Portugal and Spain. We were looking for evidence of the guerrilla movement that emerged and established itself among rural communities in the aftermath of the Spanish Civil War. They were essentially local men, but also former soldiers who had come from other parts of the peninsula to continue the fight against fascism after the Republican surrender in 1939. We were working in Cambedo, a village, which you see here, a village on the border, that was attacked by the Portuguese authorities in 1946 for sheltering a small group of Galician guerrilla fighters. Albertina Tiago, this woman, was arrested by the political police, like many other villagers, for providing such support for the guerrilla fighters. Her house was bombed and set on fire and remained in ruins until we arrived to do an excavation. We found the material traces of a modest peasant home, things that documented the profound unspoken tension between a nation state trying to enforce its authority and the community negotiating its sound way of life. This is a quite iconic object that we found in the excavations. It's a plate produced in the early 20th century that represents the Tower of Belém, which for many Portuguese is somehow the symbol of nationhood, as it represents basically the so-called discoveries, the process of colonial expansion. So as basically these local rural communities were trying to come to terms with the enforcement of this border, they had this object circulating, enforcing a certain view of the nation state and the production of the nation state. As we were digging through the house of Albertina, we heard about other stories of displacement, exile, and sheltering that were less known because they were quite ordinary. They did not evoke the heroic guerrilla fighters that were ambushed in the middle of the night by dozens of armed men. These stories were about anonymous figures who had crossed the border during and after the Civil War, as they were trying to escape Spain and reach a safer life elsewhere in Portugal or on the other side of the Atlantic. Ricinio Inocentes, a friend from Cambedo, took us to this shelter on the mountain. It is a simple shelter arranged under a large natural rock. No one can stand inside, but it is spacious enough to temporarily accommodate a small group of people. We were told that the shelter was used by farmers, guerrilla fighters, and refugees alike. As we excavated the site, we realized there was nothing to be found, nothing that could indicate the presence of those people. There was a stone pavement and some prehistoric ceramic shards, but why was it so clean? The empty shelter pointed towards the village, Cambedo. The place was empty clean because it was an ephemeral shelter to be used only when the authorities would show up in the village and made the presence of those people dangerous for the community itself. The actual shelter was the village itself. The story is embodied by the house of Albertina and the shelter on the mountain, help illuminating local attempts at resolving two conflicting notions of hospitality as they were described by Jacques Derrida. One conditional, subjected to the rule of law and the formal authority of the state, which defines what a migrant or a refugee should be. The other, unconditional hospitality. This notion signals a radical openness to someone who appears to be unknown and may even question our own status as hosts. The local community, anthropologists have shown, try to navigate these circumstances as a border community, simultaneously subject to a nation state and to the much older and complex configurations of kin and social reciprocity that regulated their lives. How else could they have risked so much to shelter guerrilla fighters and facilitate the transit of people they barely knew? These stories, almost completely new to me and my international group of colleagues, unveiled another question. Is it possible that archaeology is a way of encountering the absolute order that Derrida talked about when he described the guest, migrant, or the refugee as the figure that holds the keys to unlock ourselves from the constraints of the nation state? Could these guests from the past change our lives too? Last year, we started working in Dresnica, a village in the Dinaric Alps of Croatia. After the fascist invasion of Yugoslavia in 1941, the people of Dresnica decided to organize themselves and join the partisan resistance movement. The region is quite hilly and forested, which facilitated the circulation of the guerrilla fighters and supplies, while generating tremendous difficulties for the occupation armies. As part of the resistance efforts, the people of Dresnica provided soldiers, both men and women, labor, and supplies. They helped organizing and protecting a hospital facility as well. This hospital was mobile for a long time, moving around from one place to another, according to the war circumstances. In one of its incarnations, it was materialized in a large wooden building in the forest, which you see here. It's an illustration of this large hospital, which was burned, destroyed several times, and we can no longer see standing. It is just, it's only the memory of the site marked by a monument. This hospital was connected to a cave that was adapted to accommodate patients in the event of an attack or patients whose condition was just too serious. If you have the chance to look at the recordings, the voice recordings you had on the website, there was a small bottle of adrenaline that we found in this cave, whose model you see here. It's a 3D model from inside the cave. The hospital was maintained thanks to the many villagers that provided supplies, even in the most difficult circumstances. These doctors and nurses assisted not only soldiers, but also villagers from the wider region and people displaced by war from all over the Balkans. Not surprisingly, doctors and nurses were refugees themselves and had come from all sorts of places, even from outside Yugoslavia. The constellation of care built by the people of Dresnica was vaster than the hospital itself. Like in Campedo in Portugal, it included people's homes, even churches, and relied on their profound knowledge of the landscape. War refugees walk across the mountains trying to reach areas that had been freed from Nazi and fascist occupation and were accommodated along the way in places that there was already a long and deep history of sheltering. Oh, here is the bottle that I was just mentioning with the adrenaline still inside. Caves in particular have been used as shelters many times before in times of conflict. Last summer, we went to one of those caves. We had been told in the village that a cave near Morya, a lake near the village of Dresnica, was used as a shelter during the Second World War. We wanted to know to which degree refugees were supported locally by people from the village. What we discovered was not very different from the shelter in Campedo. Unlike in Campedo, it was a large cave and far more isolated from the nearest settlement. But again, we only had evidence of temporary human presence. There were traces of human occupation in much older times, probably the Bronze or Iron Age. A series of crosses on the cave's entrance indicated that the place had been used as a shelter since at least the Middle Ages. Actually, the local community associate these to the presence of the mythical Greeks. And the Greeks in this region of the Balkans, they correspond to what in Portugal or Spain we call the Moors, these mythical figures that somehow embody, the radical others that lived in the past. And of course, they were not Christians as us, right? The objects left by refugees in the Second World War were quite modest. They were quite modest. It was the heel of a small boot, a needle, a hair clipper, and a military bullet shell or an old rubber tire. So this was essentially everything we found inside a huge cave from the Second World War. That you see here on the left, pieces of a button, a boot, hair clipper, a needle, and a shell that was probably not even fired. And on the right side, you see a rubber tire from a bicycle, and you might wonder, why would the rubber tire from a tire from a bicycle be inside a cave in the middle of nowhere, where you obviously cannot bike? And the answer is quite evident in a way. People were reusing these materials, as they are doing even today, to fix shoes and fix pieces of clothing, so that they can keep on moving elsewhere, to a safer place. The community was quite interested on this site, more even than the military sites that are usually associated to the Second World War and narratives about brave male heroes that fight and win wars. Our work in the cave elicited more interest and new stories about its use as a shelter, or about the presence of war refugees in the region. One of the project's friends in the village, Peter Marovich, which you see here, recalled that his own mother had been sheltered there during a fascist offensive in 1944, along with other people from Dresnica. We had the chance to, as we were discussing these, to show a film that was made in Dresnica in 1964 to him, which he never saw in his life, and he spotted his own mother in the film as he was watching it. It was quite an emotional encounter. And we were able to put a face to the objects that perhaps were used by this woman and her family or people she knew during the war. Archaeological work has this tremendous potential at eliciting effective responses from people, both archaeologists and non-archaeologists. As we were digging through the ruins of a peasant home in the nearby hamlet of Tomici, we were visited by Anja Mamula. She was guided there by one of our team members, and she described how everything looked like in the old days, when the fields used to be farmed and when there were people around to take care of them. Everything is now engulfed by the forest. It looks very, very different from how it used to be. It's basically what we see there now is the result of decades of abandonment and a different kind of forced displacement of people towards other regions of Europe, Croatia, Germany, even the United States, where they try to find better lives for themselves. The house itself was absconded in a narrow valley, which made it the perfect location for one of the first partisan camps during the Liberation Wars. The builder of the house, Nikola Tomic, had immigrated to the United States and returned with some money to invest. When the war started, he lent the house to the partisans, many of whom veterans from the Spanish Civil War. Anja Mamula walked down to where we were working and told us, "I was born here as a refugee." Her mother and relatives were forced to leave their homes in the village. Her mother expected a child as much as an attack by the Germans or local fascists. And as she continued talking and walking around the house while trying to make sense of the work we were doing, she recalled around encounters with the migrants just outside our home. The region of Dresnica is now walked every day by people from the Middle East of Central Asia who try to reach South Central Europe and find better lives for themselves and their families. Anja Mamula believes that they are migrating because of wars raging in the places where they are originally from, and inevitably links their experience to her own story. This is how she explains the duty of hospitality. We cannot communicate with each other, but we share something. Anja Mamula pushed forward for her own understanding of what we would call the unconditional hospitality. For more than the past, our archaeological work is exposing the tensions that permeate local and national conversations about migration and hospitality. Of course, this is not the kind of narrative that is consensual anywhere, much less in a place like this. As you will probably see, as Yannis and Rachael talk about Greece and Lesbos, there are many tensions in the communities and about how to deal with the people who are coming, the people who are arriving in their communities or just passing by. We too are being confronted by these tensions as we work with communities that try to, or ask questions and try to find answers. Who are you? Where are you coming from? What can I do? As archaeologists, our work is twofold. First, to welcome unconditionally these guests that arrive from the past in form of objects, memories, caves, and to link them to the experiences of migration and exile of the present. We need them all to free ourselves from the constraints of the nation state and the hypocritical politics of hospitality. All the things that took me and my colleagues to the north of Portugal, even before we started making sense of what we were looking for. We just had this feeling of discomfort about everything around us, politics, and even the practice of archaeology itself. So this is a way of responding to Michel Agier's calls to understand and explore communal forms of hospitality, which are re-emerging as a result of a dissatisfaction with ongoing projects of nation-state building in the context of a humanitarian crisis. And second, we need to contribute to diversify the archive of humanity, as Rachael Mbembe spoke about here at the Culture Gest a while ago. And this is to be an alternative archive in which we mobilize histories of care and hospitality that challenge both hegemonic narratives about the past and the inevitabilities of the present. Our task is somehow, and again to paraphrase Rachael Mbembe, to use archaeology and use it as a radical tool of care and healing. So thank you.
Well, I forgot to put the micro on, but I'm on now. Thank you, Rui. Thank you very much. I was almost feeling to start the conversation by some of the things that you said in your presentation, but we are now moving to Rachael. Rachael, welcome, and please.
Thank you.
The stage is yours.
Open system browser. I'm really sorry about this. It's yes. Security. It's asking me for some extra security thing.
Technology sometimes does that.
Here we go. Here we go. I think I've got it now.
Okay.
Yes. Lock to make changes. Okay. Yes, it's going to let me do it now. Sorry.
No problem.
That sounded like a good click. Okay, I think it's doing it now. Right, sorry everyone. Okay. Right. Okay. So I also just wanted to start by saying thank you very much to Liliana for inviting me to participate, and also that it's a real privilege to work in this panel with Yannis and Rui, both of whom I follow their work very closely and have learned a lot from them too. So I thought it might be useful just to think about contemporary archaeology to start with, and essentially the notion of that archaeological methods could be useful and usefully applied to contemporary society was really first mooted about 40 years ago when Professor Bill Rathjer in Arizona developed the Tucson Garbage Project, which was essentially a study of then contemporary people's rubbish dumps. And his question was really, do people throw away what they think they throw away? And they don't. So this very long-running project started in 1973 And it really prompted questions such as, is this an archaeology of us, of modern people? And if so, then who are the us? Who are we? Are we white male capitalists? Are we lesbians? Are we descendants of African slaves? And these sorts of criticisms and questions have very much informed contemporary archaeology as a movement. And it's really taken off in the way that Rui and Yannis and I practice it very much in the last 20 years. All archaeology is the study of material culture and its relationships between people and places, so past and present. Archaeological data, landscapes, buildings, objects, these are not passive things. They're not confined to particular historical periods. They are multi-temporal, they're politically active, and they are constituents of today, of the present. And this means that they also have the capacity to affect the future. So if we make our focus the method, the way that we do archaeology, then pretty much anything material can be studied using archaeological method, regardless of its age or antiquity or not. So a megalith, a medieval mosque, or in our case, the material culture of modern human migration. And so in these two pictures, there's Bill Rathjer on his rubbish heap in the bottom, but the top picture I took at the Calais Jungle refugee camp in November 2016, which was a really strange time to visit it because the bulldozers had already bulldozed one half of it. And well, they bulldozed the whole lot, but they were razing to the ground the whole Calais Jungle site. And it had only been bulldozed for about 1 month. So when I turned up with 2 other archaeologists and an architect who I was working on a project with, the police, the local police, who were quite aggressive, we had this really surreal conversation where they said, "What are you doing?" And we said, "We're archaeologists." And they said, "There's nothing here." And we said, "There's loads here. There's posts, there's rubbish all over the floor. There's loads of stuff for archaeologists. This is what archaeologists study." And we had this surreal conversation where they were trying to tell us that we must be sociologists because it was contemporary. So it was quite interesting. I can't imagine having the same kind of conversation with British police. So to some degree, for me, I think contemporary archaeology was really able to develop as a subgenre due to the application of particularly things like Marxist philosophy. I think that's largely because obviously Marxism insists that there are alternatives to capitalism. And this is quite a big theme within contemporary archaeology. For me, feminism and particularly decolonial sort of theories, ways of thinking, and very much the very welcome introduction of indigenous methods and perspectives. These all offer very useful contexts in which to practice contemporary archaeology, because in their different ways, they each hold that the status quo is not natural. It's the product of structural inequality. And when that's unchecked, that is how injustices are reproduced generation after generation. So I would suggest that if contemporary archaeology has a driving imperative, it might be that we try to harness what we find empirically and use it to question what we take for granted in the world around us. So in this way, contemporary archaeology is inherently activist, because so often it actually involves documenting and recording that which official authorities either ignore or deny. So in my work, when I was documenting homelessness, it was just denied that there were that many homeless people, or that people were living under a bridge, or it was just denied. And it's either kind of sweep it under the carpet, deny it, or there are willful attempts to destroy and make disappear things that are happening. And a good example of that is the Calais Jungle just being bulldozed. But the people themselves then end up having to live in bushes or World War II shelters. The people are still there. And in this sense, I think that this contemporary archaeology can sometimes function as a sort of like a forensic citizen journalism, if you like. So my current project, as Liliana said, is called Migrant Materialities, and it involves working with small groups of migrants and refugees in Plymouth in the UK, where I live, in northern Sweden, very far rural North Sweden, and in Athens in Greece. And I was hoping to get to Serbia, but COVID-19 put pay to that. So I'm still hoping to get to Serbia at some point. So what I tend to do is work with people in all sorts of, however I can get people to document and record the way that material culture plays a role in their personal and cultural identity once they, on their journey, on their migratory journey, but also once they arrive in their so-called destination. So in this top picture, that was a drawing workshop I did with some children in a squat in Athens. And I just asked them a simple question. I said, draw this particular, it wasn't actually an NGO, it's a group of people called Our House, and they were renting houses for homeless people, homeless refugees, children, pregnant women, and they were renting flats and houses in Athens and taking children and pregnant women and babies out of the parks, which are dangerous, where they were being raped and much more vulnerable to all sorts of terrible things, and putting them into flats. And I went to one of these houses and worked with these children, and I just asked them, what does our house mean to you? And it was interesting that they all drew home or flowers or hearts or food. It was quite stark. I remember coming home and telling my own children about these children. And then I also work with other creative professionals. So in the middle picture, there's Sana Morani, Dr. Sana Morani, who's she's Associate Professor of Spatial Practice at the University of Plymouth. And she and I have worked together on a couple of projects. And so we use similar but different methodologies in terms of documenting space effectively. And Sana, I'll come on to a map that Sana made a bit later. And then the bottom picture is a map. The idea was entirely one of my participants, Sagatel Basil. He owned a literary cafe in Aleppo before he had to flee. And he had this great idea that, so there's a little wooden turtle you can see. And he said, I want to make a map of my journey. And we're now turning it into a film. But the turtle, because he said, as a refugee, you're like a turtle. You have to have your world on your back. And he made these cards or these pictures and he set them out across the table, and then he wound thread around the various places. And what was fascinating was it was visualizing the way that his own experience as a refugee is not a direct from Aleppo to Sweden. It goes via Armenia and Turkey and Egypt, and it's such a complicated, double refugee experience. Since 2016, I've been working in places such as Pamparaki Warehouse, which is the central distribution warehouse for donations made to people who are living in forced displacement in Greece. It was on the site of the former Olympics, 2004 Olympics, so it's a huge space. And as you can see, just absolutely full of boxes and bags, and it's enormous. And it's was entirely run by volunteers, where donations would arrive and then, they would need to be sorted, shoes would need to be paired up. And it was a total mishmash of stuff. So some things were very practical and useful, such as shoes, warm coats, winter jumpers, children's clothes, waterproof jackets. And then sometimes you'd find really weird things like a beekeeper's suit or a wedding dress or ice skates. Like, whoever thought to donate ice skates? I don't know. Anyway, so I would try and work in these places because then it's a useful way to get to know people and bump into refugees, migrants, humanitarians, volunteers. Try and be there more than just parachute in as an academic, ask people loads of questions and then bog off back to Oxford. So in doing this, I got to meet people, and then I would essentially use a variety of methods. So once people were happy to work with me, then I might walk around with them, recording sound or making short videos and film, taking photographs, drawing workshops, that sort of thing. So fieldwork has often involved visiting people in their homes or in their temporary homes and using photography, but also audio and sometimes film to make sort of small interviews, on-site interviews, and also document the quality, or sadly very often the lack of quality, in the type of accommodation that people experience. In Athens, I was in lots of squats, but in Plymouth, the two pictures on the left are from Plymouth in the UK. That's the type of quality housing that asylum seekers get. It's damp, it's dirty, it's very unpleasant. And that's what they get while they're waiting to see if their asylum claim is going to be processed. It's also often very overcrowded. People often comment to me that the natural and built environment obviously is dramatically different from home. Particularly, this was particularly stark when I was in Krokom, which is very far northern rural Sweden. And there's refugees from largely Syria, Afghanistan, Eritrea, working. Many of the Eritreans are loggers. So actually, one Syrian man said to me, "I would like to get a job logging, but I can't because everyone speaks Tigrinya." So there's this kind of massive cultural change in the way that, now if you go to northern Sweden, many of the loggers are Eritrean and they speak Tigrinya, which is a big change. But one of the reasons that people are housed that far north and in those rural communities is because many young Swedes don't want to live there because there's not very much going on. A lot of people of retirement age. So the main jobs are logging or kind of care home work. But people often, when I make these interviews in their houses, they will often say to me, it's not, initially you think, well, yeah, you're from Eritrea or Syria. You're now living in, -30 half of the year and it's dark. It's very different. And they say, no, it's not so much the temperature. It's the way in which the environment has created a completely different domestic culture. So there's no cafe culture. It's too cold for that. It's too dark for that. And for people who are used to living a lot of their lives, on the street, in cafe or in markets, having bigger families, having many more people bustling around, it's a real challenge. Their material and social lives are dramatically affected by what people have access to or are constrained from. And the objects too, the objects also, they experience a sort of a change to their biographies as a result of their own migratory journeys. So for example, the aubergine corers on the right, they were brought to northern Sweden by a woman who, she said to me, I put them in my backpack because when we had to leave Syria, I used them every day. So I just put them in my backpack without thinking. But now she keeps them as heirlooms because, in her words, aubergine in Sweden is not the same. It's crunchy. I cannot use them here. And so I keep them for my daughter. They are her heritage. And the yellow square of card on the left belongs to a man from Iraq. I met him again in northern Sweden. He came overland from Iraq. So for a while he was staying in IOM accommodation in Athens. And one night when he was in this small hotel, an official came in and handed everyone a square of coloured paper, some blue, some green, some yellow. And he was instructed to be ready the following morning at 4:30 a.m. to take a bus to the airport. And he said, this man, as he handed out the cards, he said, if you have a yellow square, you go to Sweden, blue square, Finland, green square, Denmark. And it was that quick. And so the Iraqi man keeps this square of yellow paper because, as he puts it, it's my fate. This, this piece of paper is my destiny. I came to Sweden. A lot of people, I think, imagine the migration journey as a straight line, people leave their country of origin and travel to Europe, and then they apply for asylum. But the truth is that, in my experience, very, very, very few people have a journey that straightforward. For most people, the mobility is incessant. It doesn't stop. So moving from one place to another, short stays in dangerous, inadequate accommodation very often. But this very often will continue once they get to their so-called destination. This map, which is, it's mixed media, and it was produced by one of our migrant materialities team, and Sana Morani, who's the architect colleague who I work with, who's based at Plymouth. And what they tried to do was reflect on the number of times that the refugee woman had been moved by the council authorities. She had been moved 14 times in less than 2 years within UK. And it incorporates some of the things which are very significant to her. So you can see in the bottom of the picture, there's her, she was very proud. She's actually a human rights lawyer, and she was very proud of having painted her flat. So when I went to visit her, when she finally got her sort of permanent social housing, she decorated it beautifully, and she texted me and she said, I've done many things in my life. You know, I'm sort of highly professional person, but I have never before painted the inside of a house. You done interior decorating. So she was really proud of this new skill. But yeah, so the map incorporates her cat and some scarves, which they're very special to her for sort of cultural and personal association. But also the 2 suitcases that she brought when she first came to the country. She just had those 2 suitcases and her young daughter on her own. And yeah, they were moved 14 times in 2 years. And I have yet to do the research, but I cannot believe that that's economic, let alone humane. So our intention in producing these maps, and maps such as these, is really to try to sort of demonstrate how people get shoved around and moved about all the time. Okay. And then there's also, I wanted to talk about this, if I could find the right bit. I can't, I'll just tell you about it. So when I was applying for visas for people, so before COVID, I was supposed to hold a sort of big interpretation workshop in Oxford, which would have had 12 refugee colleagues and 4 other academic colleagues come together, and we were going to go through all the data and interpret it together and work out at that meeting. It was scheduled to be a 8-day meeting, and we would eat together, walk together, and come up with a way to tell this story as a public heritage exhibition. And then COVID happened, and so everything had to go online. But anyway, in applying to bring people from Athens, from Sweden, and ideally from Serbia to Oxford, I had to apply for visas for all of these people. And it's the experience of applying for visas into the UK system has led me to conceive of the visa form itself as the border, which might sound obvious, but it's things like when we were applying for the visa, if you put the apostrophe in St Margaret's Road, which is grammatically correct, the form rejects it and doesn't tell you why or what to do to progress. So the form is actually set up, it's designed so that you can't go on to the next page unless the software is completely happy with what you've already entered. There's no way of previewing or downloading the form. So you can't prepare for the challenges that it presents to you. There's also an incredibly narrow window of only 3 months between when you can only apply for your visa and then visit within 3 months. And furthermore, the UK advertises the standard visitor visa will cost you £95. But in every case, all the people I applied for, it was more than £600 extra per person in totally hidden costs, which again, you don't know you're going to have to pay because you can't get through the form. You can't download the form or prepare. So I see this as a fully intentional way to obfuscate, way to make it more difficult. So I'm kind of interested in how we can use the process to demonstrate how difficult it is, and it's not illegal to get a visa. So I think what I've presented here is just a really small selection of the type of content that I'm still working on. I'm only halfway through this project. The idea had been to present a big public heritage exhibition with actual objects and show some of our films and present some of the maps and the things themselves and photographs, of course. But it's looking increasingly likely that I won't be able to do that for coronavirus reasons. So instead, we are now focusing on creating a sort of immersive digital tour, which is an entirely new world for me, because I can barely share my screen. So yeah, that's what we're up to. And I would just ask that if you were planning to go to Culturgest, tonight, and if you were going to buy a beer or have a meal or take a bus or a taxi, maybe you could donate that money that you would have spent to the NGOs. One of the ones I'm a big fan of is Cora. They do a lot of language training, skills training. They offer people spaces to work in, to meet, to have friends. They have an amazing kitchen, and it's generally a good place that supports people who are displaced in Athens. Thanks very much for listening, and yeah, welcome any comments or questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rachel. We'll keep the comments for after Yannis Hamilakis' presentation. I'm collecting here all my comments, and I just remembering I would like to remember now our audience that they can also comment and put their questions in through Facebook or YouTube. And now, please, Yannis, thank you very much for being here, and it's your turn.
Thank you very much, Liana, and thank you to the Foundation for this kind invitation and for bringing us together. It's a pleasure to be with Rachel and with Rui and with all of you talking. I keep learning from their work, and I'm looking forward to our collective discussion tonight. Now, as you can see in a minute, I have changed the title of my presentation from the one I gave originally to Liana, and there was a reason for it. The reason was to make my presentation more focused and address the central concept of our event tonight, the concept of hospitality. And as you will also see in a minute, this presentation links directly to both Rachel's and Ruiz's presentation, because it continues the discussion about the concept of hospitality that Rui started, but brings us also into focus with Rachel's presentation, because my context of study is more or less the same, the context of Greece, although I'll be focusing on the border. So what I will try and do today is to give you a sense of what I do in my own work, but also give you a sense of the conceptual, the ethical, and the political problems that we face while doing this work. Like my other colleagues, I also work closely with a number of people, and I'm very, very grateful to them, all the interlocutors I've met, all the migrating people. And I want to emphasize that I do not myself like the term migrants. I do not like, because of the essentialism it implies. The idea that somebody is a migrant, meaning that he or she is no longer an architect, a painter, an archaeologist or chemist, but somebody who is landed with this essentialist tag and label. So I would rather talk about people who are on the move, migrating people who are, who are on a journey in many ways, both literally and metaphorically, as you will see in a minute. So I'll read my text and then we'll have a discussion. So it was July 2017, and I was walking together with two then graduate students from my own university, from Brown, outside the infamous camp of Morya on the island of Lesbos on the Greek-Turkish border. Now you're familiar with the context. We're talking about an island very close to the Turkish mainland and one of the entry points from Turkey into Greece. And as you will see, Lesbos is one of the islands that have been operating for a number of years as entry points, but also the islands that form an archipelago of detention and securitization. This map in Greek, shows the places where the European Union has actually established what they call hotspots, or reception and identification centers. And as we'll see in a minute, they are actually much more than that. So in this context, I've been carrying out for many years, since 2016, what I call archaeological ethnography. But this is also a site not only of research, but also of witnessing and activism. As you know, this site was completely destroyed by fire in September of this year. My last visit to this island was in October, so I'll talk to you also about it as an ruinous site. When this site was in operation, it was a highly militarized one and a closely guarded one, especially the walled compound. Access to it was tightly regulated. We would often spend time, however, around it, walking outside and encountering and talking to people. As we were walking at the back of the walled compound that day, very close to the fence, we noticed a group of people, mostly it seems from South Asia, gathered around a cooking facility. The smell of cooking food had reached us before we even saw them. And when a middle-aged man who seemed to have been the cook in charge spotted us, he invited us in. He pointed to a hole in the metal fence, a hole that I had seen and had spotted myself from a previous visit. So he asked us to actually pass through and go inside, which is not officially allowed. So this place is a stage for the performance of the rituals of securitization and humanitarianism, and has as a stage its front regions and its back regions to recall governments. Things happen here at the back, seemingly away from the eyes of the police and away from the army and the administration. At that moment, with some hesitation, because it was not really allowed, it was not legal, we decided to accept the invitation and enter into the camp and get in. The man it turned out was from Pakistan, and so were the younger people, the younger men around him. Nearby were the several men from Africa mostly. In front of him, there was a hot metal plate, which was used to make rotis, the flatbread of South Asia. It turned out that this was a repurposed street sign, which he had found and modified it into a hot plate. Next to it, a rectangular oil can was used as a hearth, on top of which there was a cooking pot boiling. We could smell that chicken was cooked there, and it was almost ready by the time of our visit. As we started chatting, the man offered us some of their deliciously tasting food made here in the squalor of this razor-white facility. the guest had turned into a host. And amidst this frustration in being detained in this place, with few, if any, chances of an asylum status, and with deportation likely, his resilience, inventiveness, and generosity still reverberate with me. In the domain of migration, food provision, quality, taste, and cultural and nutritional value have become major battlegrounds for migrants, for migrating people, I would say, for local people, authorities, and society in general. I may be referring to food once or twice today, but I wanted to evoke this moment from my own ethnographic diary to open up the discussion on hospitality, which we are supposed to discuss and debate today. So, archaeologies of hospitality. I will attempt to explore and interrogate briefly both terms, using primarily this specific space, the space of Morya. The infamous camp of Morya, a migrant settlement, also a hotspot in EU terminology, a processing and detention center, an asylum application center, a pre-departure center, that's EU terminology, pre-departure center, a euphemism, in other words, for a prison for people to be deported. And now, of course, a glorious ruin, a space of abandonment and decay, but a place that perhaps can teach us even more as a ruin, as an archaeological site. And this is one of the entrances to that detention center inside the compound, the pre-departure center. Its cell is called here Pre-Removal Detention Center of Lesbos. To start with, what are we to make of the concept of hospitality? And to what extent is it appropriate for the phenomena we want to discuss today, the mass migrations mostly from the global south, the global north, which are bound to become, as we know, more pronounced in the years to come, phenomena which characterized our era, which I have suggested we should call the new nomadic age. Hospitality, as we know very well, and as has been discussed extensively in the philosophical literature, Rui already mentioned this, implies a host and a guest, which are bound in an asymmetrical relationship. It assumes ownership, command, sovereignty over one's home. The guest needs to accept that relationship, which brings with it certain obligations on his and her part. If she does not fulfill these obligations, they are deemed ungrateful. They would be accused of overstaying the host's welcome, and they should depart. Such understanding of hospitality as a relationship of power has been discussed extensively, most notably by Jacques Derrida, amongst others. At the border, however, such an unwritten contract is loaded with additional implied meanings and assumptions. The border does many things, as we know. It delineates national and supranational entities, produces a border economy, constitutes a border regime, which is often a state of exception, and categorizes people and produces illegality. As Etienne Balibar has noted, the border is also an affirmation of ownership. The border I'll be talking about, the border between Greece and Turkey, is also an external border of the European Union and the border between the global south and the global north. This tightly guarded and highly militarized border constitutes a reaffirmation of ownership at the national and supranational level. It reminds people of the global order, which has been established at least since the 19th century, the order of colonization and of white European supremacy. This is a fault line, a buffer zone, which includes two nation states, Greece and Turkey. In this fault line, the host dispenses his version of hospitality and issues a set of conditions and obligations that go with it. At the same time, he reminds the arriving stranger that her status as a guest is temporary and under suspension, but also that the house rules require of her to accept that this house does not belong to her, and that she has to accept this ownership status and obey by it. One of the key rules of this border hospitality is that the guest-to-be, the guest under suspension, will need to reveal everything about herself. The reasons she left home, the history of her journey, and about other previous attempts to cross borders and appeal for protection. Think of all the interviews, all the processes that they have to go through to detail in every single and little detail their histories and their journeys. And any piece of such information could be an immediate reason for suspending the status of the guest. Some scholars have called this contemporary border hospitality, the hospitality under suspension, hostile hospitality, which is very interesting formulation to have. Now, philosophers have told us that a way out of this asymmetrical and power-laden hospitality is to accept and implement another version of hospitality, a hospitality without conditions, hospitality that does not ask why the potential guest is fleeing home, but one which provides refuge instead and facilitates the journey. One could say that this version of the ethics of unconditional solidarity prevailed to some extent in the European borders in 2015 and early 2016. This was the brief moment of the Syrian exodus. This was the moment when the global North was made aware of the mass border crossing and migration, and the phenomena gained public prominence and wide media attention. Recall all the news stories that came out at that brief moment. This was a very brief moment when a few million people were welcomed as transient guests, and they were allowed to pass through. They were allowed to continue the journey and even gain asylum status in countries such as Germany, Sweden, and others. But as I said, this was a very, very brief moment indeed, and even then it applied selectively to people. Families, especially from Syria and other war zones, were luckier in many ways than, let's say, single men and many single women, especially the ones who were attempting to cross from the central Mediterranean or West Mediterranean routes into Italy or Spain. Now, with the EU-Turkey treaty signed in March 2016, the border regime and the regime of hostile hospitality was immediately reestablished. Border islands became open prisons as people could not move out of them while their asylum case was being examined. They could not continue their journey, and they could resettle in the mainland only in very special circumstances by showing and demonstrating clear vulnerability. Since 2019, in my own context of work in the border between Turkey and Greece, we have entered a third phase, a phase in which the regime of hostile hospitality has gained renewed strength and reached new heights. The new, openly anti-migrant government of Greece means that illegal pushbacks are now routine. In other words, border crossers are forcefully preventing from reaching the coast. They are taken off rubber dinghies and put into rafts without an engine and pushed back into Turkish territorial waters. And there have been many cases where this has been documented by many organizations, although the government itself officially still denies it. Even when they reach the coast and they hide in the woods to avoid such a fate, their arrival is often not officially recorded, and they're almost abandoned, and they're almost abducted very often before they can actually reach the authorities, the center of identification, let's say, and they are thrown into the sea and pushed towards Turkey. The pandemic of this year and the total destruction of Morya by fire in September, and also the new pact on asylum announced by the European Union at the end of September have signaled yet another phase, which we're just entering, and we can discuss later on. Now, as for archaeology, my colleagues have already shown the value of archaeological approach into this phenomenon as we explore the intersection of materiality and temporality and trace carefully the shape and evoke the texture of migrant experience. After my first visit to Lesbos in 2016, I drafted a short text for an American magazine, The Nation, mostly as writing therapy for myself. The title of that piece was The Future Ruins of the European Union, the Morya camp on Lesbos. As archaeologists, we study ruins, decay, and ruination, and we can perhaps better than others. We can perhaps better than others see and recognize prospective ruins too, ruins to be. Both the material realities which are destined to decay and fall into a state of ruins very fast, state of ruination very fast, but also the material expressions of a ruinous policy, which is already falling apart and crumbling the moment it's put into place and materialized. And talking of ruins, I want to take you through a very brief tour of the ruins of Morya right now as a way of showing to you the present materiality and what it can actually teach us about the experience of migration. So this is the wall compound of Morya. Morya has been a huge settlement in recent years. It was officially built for 3,000 people. In January, it actually reached about 20,000 people. And when the fire broke in September, the number were about 12 people, but of course the numbers are not accurate. So you can see the facade of the walled compound, the front region of Morya. And of course, this is what you see from the opposite hill, the place as a burned down ruin. You can walk inside the wall compound and you can encounter a landscape dominated by not only the remnants of this kind of facility, but mostly a landscape of cement, metal, prefab buildings, and plastic. This is the asylum building. This is the building. In fact, this building, as Morya as well, had actually been burned in the past several times. And I should mention here that something we do not hear about this camp is that it had been for many years a place of organizing and protest as well. So I have, throughout my work there, I have encountered many cases of political organizing and protestation by migrants themselves. And of course, some of you may remember that in 2017, there was a major uprising in Morya. 35 people were arrested and went through trial for many, many months. So this specific building had been actually burned in the past several times. This is the last one, and the one that actually destroyed completely as everything else. What I want to show in this image is the materiality of the building itself. You can see that we're talking about a space that is highly fortified with razor wire. And in fact, there is an empty space, a void between the inside and the outside. between the space where the employees of the asylum service are located and the space outside, which is the space where migrants will be located. So a migrating person, a border crosser, will put his and her hand through this hole to deliver the pieces of paper to the employee inside. So the whole construction is actually designed to minimize any close contact between the person who is applying and the person who is going to process this application. Hence, the many layers of razor wire, and hence the void between these two spaces. But you can even go inside the commander's office, the ruined commander's office. And these are a couple of photos from that inside. By the way, it didn't seem to be any effort by the authorities to protect any of the, at least paper documents that were actually left on site. And it was pretty heartbreaking to encounter during my visit, paper records of personal interviews of people where the whole story of a person's journey would be recorded by hand. And then during the kind of destruction, fire would be left there and abandoned and be actually open to anybody to see and to collect or take. So that's another kind of facet of this destruction. This chart is very interesting for us because it shows the vertical or hierarchical, almost militarized kind of organization of this place, with the commander is the name of the person in charge and the deputy commander, but also gives us a sense of what I call the assemblage of migration, the many different entities, the many different actors and agents that are co-functioning to produce this operation, from small NGOs to bigger NGOs, to the army, to the police, to the High Commission for Refugees, to the European Union, and more besides. And this is you could call this a Pompeii moment. This is a board that the commander used to use to record the figures, the numbers every day. And this is the last counting. This is the last day. The first fire was on the 8th. There was also a fire on the 9th and the 10th. But on the 8th, before the commander left the office, you could see the numbers of people in the different sections of the camp. You can also see a different box down that says departures from Morya, 1 death, and as thanatos. Yeah. So unlike the hierarchical, militarized almost landscape of the interior of the camp, the interior of the compound, if you go around and explore the different, landscape features around that compound, you'll notice that here we have a very, very different picture. Here you have a landscape dominated by perishable materials, mostly wood and stone, and of course earth, materials that people were using to build their own shelter, to build their own tents, and also their own lives in many ways. I want to focus on this picture for a moment because it took me a minute or so to understand what is happening here. And then I realized that this is in fact the painting workshop. And what you see are cans of paint, as you can tell here. And it is the painting workshop of my friend, Shukran Shazad. We can see them on the left over there, a collaborator and a friend whose work we've been kind of showing in our exhibition at Brown University at the moment. Some of you may know of an exhibition called Transit Matter, Assemblages of Migration in the Mediterranean. And one of the things that we wanted to foreground and show is the artistic work that people who lived on Morya produced. Shukran, a painter and a singer from Afghanistan, had actually worked for many, many months as part of an organization called Wave of Hope for the Future, which we would ask you to support. And you see here his painting workshop, and what I encountered in October was the remnants of that workshop. Fortunately, Shukran continues painting now in the new camp, what people call Morya 2, and has started again with new materials and new strength and new energy to continue his work. I also wanted very briefly to show how much work has gone into reshaping the landscape around Morya, how much work has gone into providing for people even temporary shelters and making this space a place of daily life and experience. So you can see, for example, here an outline of a shelter, of a house, you could call it a hut. And you will see that the people who used to live here actually used the water bottles that they could take daily from the official provision of food, and they've made them into some sort of platform, perhaps platform for sleeping, platform for something else, but a platform that formed and shaped the interior of this specific shelter. And you could still see today the many sunken ovens, tandoors, which is the Middle Eastern oven for making flatbread in Afghanistan, as well as many other countries in the Middle East. And there were several of them I had seen and recorded and spoken to people about several times in the past. You can still see them as features in the landscape of Morya. Now, I want to finish very soon and return to the concept of hospitality as an idea, and on whether it is appropriate for what is happening today with migration. And I want to take you to another context for a second. And this is the context of the so-called life vest or life jacket cemetery on the north of the island. When we were excavating this site on the north of Lesbos, which is actually, this site is a secondary accumulation of border crossing remnants, which were collected by volunteers and municipal workers from the beaches. So you can see that this site is already also a heritage space, perhaps a dark heritage space, with people going and photographing and kind of taking pictures of this kind of reality over there. So when we're excavating here, we encounter, amongst other things, two objects, which I want to leave you with. This one, an object of an archaeology of care, a baby bottle feeder, which made the journey all the way from Iraq, and which still preserved the traces of milk in it. And a plastic container of anti-stress pills made in Canada. Found amongst the masses of life vests and rubber boats, this object, we assume, was brought by a volunteer who traveled to Lesbos to welcome border crossers and provide orientation, clothing, and assistance. And as we know, there were hundreds of them who were working on the beaches of Lesbos until recently, in fact. You could say that this object speaks to the complete and unconditional hospitality, the welcoming of a guest without house rules and conditions and questions. It also speaks to the cost of such stance, to the ordeal and the stress that goes with it. But alternatively, I want to suggest that it also evokes not hospitality, but solidarity. Not the solidarity reference in the new EU Asylum Pact, which is a solidarity amongst nation states, complete with deportation sponsorships, but the critical and radical solidarity that refuses to recognize a host and a guest, a house owner and a stranger. One that dispenses of home ownership in favor of relationships with places and beings. One that sees border crossers not as people of concern, which is a terminology often used, helpless persons in need, but as co-travelers, fellow walkers, traversing the ruinous landscapes of our nomadic age. We should walk with them. Thank you very much. And I want to ask you to go into the website of the organization and find out about two collaborating organizations I've been working with. One is called Refocus Media Labs, which actually trains young migrating people into photography and filmmaking. And the other is the one that I mentioned already, Wave, Hope for the Future, which actually is self-help and self-organization initiative by people from Afghanistan mostly, and has organized a number of schools and camps, including the painting school I showed you. So please go and donate to their efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yannis. Just, if you can just, yes, okay, good. Thank you very, very much. Just a note about information about the ONGOs of the organizations that you are asking to support. We can leave that information in the comment box of YouTube and Facebook, just to remind this, so that the audience can go easily also and inform themselves a little bit more about their work. So, thank you very much. We are now in the moment where we can start to, I suggested in a very organic way that we start to discuss about this. First, perhaps among us, and then I will open the debate to the audience. So I invite those who are listening us to interact and to participate, and then I will transmit the questions. Perhaps just to make this transition, I was, of course, hospitality was the subject, and it appeared in all your different presentations, and I was triggered by this idea of that you, Yannis, that you mentioned of the guest that turned into a host. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about a former experience that I had when I was organizing another debate some years ago in another venue, where we were organizing. We invited some people actually with the experience of being on the move, of being migrants, of being on the move, to use your terminology, to speak about their experience of being accepted in Portugal, because we have very good laws, very good rules, but then the experience of integration, it's something sometimes different. So something that was happening at that moment, it's that they were also creating through, there was a new association that was created at that time, that was created by I'll use migrant people, so the people that were in this situation of being mostly with the status of refugees. So somehow they were, in the absence of some conditions, they were becoming also their own hosts somehow, both in very informal ways. There is a coffee in the north of Lisbon, in the outskirts, where it's the meeting place, where everyone arrives here. They know that it's there that they will find support, and this support comes from other people who are in the same situation, and not from people like us who are in the, as I'm generalizing, of course. So I was like, I thought about this when you gave this image of a guest that turns into host, and I thought about this idea of sometimes these persons, they need to create also in very difficult conditions to create their own tools in order to have the experience of hospitality, because lots of them, what they see when they arrive to Europe is those images that Yannis, you show now in the end of Morya and other camps. I wonder if you if in your practices, and this is a general question, if you, in your practices you found these examples of somehow self-determination. I don't know if you want to comment on these or...
Yeah, I could start very briefly. Yes, I think you're right. We are seeing many of those attempts. Just a brief comment on this guest and host relationship. As I said at the beginning, I was myself kind of quite taken by that initiative and also very touched by that specific kind of gesture. I would say, however, that that specific interlocutor who invited us in was not performing the host in the more conventional sense we understand the concept of hospitality. In other words, as I said in both, I think both Rui and myself said in our presentations, that relationship assumes superiority, assumes ownership, assumes that, you know, this is my house, you're coming and I'm welcoming you. That man did not say to us through his gesture, this is my place and I'm inviting you in. What he actually said to us is that, look what's happening here, and look, I found this street sign, which I managed to make into a hot plate. Yeah, and I'm cooking, and I'm making some rotis, and we're cooking some chicken. So come and share it with us. So it was not that conventional sense of host-guest relationship, yes, and the implied kind of asymmetry, but it was a moment of kind of establishing a connection based on place, on experience, and on the moment. It was a relationship of coexistence as two, human beings kind of in the midst of that space of detention. So that's why I think this makes that moment so powerful and important. To your second point about initiatives of migrants and camps, I've been astounded, I've been amazed by how many self-organization initiatives actually exist in camps. Morya itself, especially in the last few years, when the authorities were more or less given up, when the number of people was such high that they could not really cope with providing for the needs of shelter, food, or other assistance. So most people actually took it to their own hands to create their own shelter, to cook their own food, to provide for their children. None of the children in Morya actually went to school, right? So schooling was something that many migrants wanted to actually do it themselves. Now, it's interesting that these self-organizing initiatives often found themselves against both the authorities of the camp and the big NGOs. Mm. I have recorded cases where big NGOs saw these initiatives as a threat. So these initiatives are something that is actually beyond their control. When my friends who put together the Wave of Hope for the Future gathered all the teachers from Afghanistan and said, we're going to have our own schools here. Yeah? They actually found themselves that they would be harassed almost daily by the police and the authorities, but also they would be questioned by the big NGO that was actually in charge of that space. And they would come and say to them, look, we are renting this space. You cannot build your own school. And also, why do you want to actually have school yourselves? We'll teach you some things. So you can see that there is as I said, there is an assemblage of migration operation, and very often an initiative from the ground, a self-help initiative and agency faces obstacles, but they've managed to succeed. And after a while, they've been accepted by both the authorities and the organizations. So they started in Morya, but I know that there are now other schooling facilities by the same organization in other camps in mainland, in Arizona and a few other places. So just some brief thoughts to your question.
Yes. Thank you. I think, Rachael, you had something to add on this?
Just that, well, two things really. That I had a very similar experience to Yannis in the squats, in particularly second school squats, sometimes known as Jasmine squat, in Athens, in Archaeology in Athens, where squats change a lot. The feeling changes. They feel safer, more dangerous. They're changing all the time. But when I was there in last year, 2019. I was in Athens 3 times doing field work, and there was a relatively stable population of mainly Syrian and Kurdish people in the squat. And when I was working or volunteering in the warehouse sorting things, the warehouse was facing eviction with nowhere to go. And at that time, the Greek government had stopped they just stopped, or at least the process of people applying for their card, which means that they get a small amount of money through the ESTA, was stopped, was so slow. People were there for months and months with nothing. And so at one point, the squat was only receiving food from the warehouse. And so the adults were eating one meal of, it was just bread and some fruit, perhaps, very, very little food. And I was sort of watching this happen as the delivery would come in from the warehouse, and a small amount of food, because it had to be distributed across everyone. So a small amount was given to the people in the squat. And they would make a lot from it, but there wasn't enough to go around. So the children were fed, and elderly people were fed, and then women were fed. But some of the men were just eating, like just a small amount of bread and a piece of fruit a day. And, there's nothing like hunger to make people angry. But people were not angry. They were desperate to work. They were going out, some of the men were going out laboring, but for cash, And then, of course, they would be taken for granted. They'd labor all day in the Athenian sun and be paid, €10 if they're lucky. Mm. And so I was there many times, but every time I went, people insisted on giving me coffee. And I eventually said, I'm really uncomfortable taking any coffee from you. And it was explained to me, it's offensive to us if you don't take this coffee, because part of being, you ask us to tell us, how do we continue to be Syrian? How do we continue to be Kurdish? You ask us, how do we do that with things, with material culture? Well, one of the ways we do it is we always give you coffee. You don't have a choice. You have to drink some coffee. And so I would sit, because it was a school, the squat had been a school, the furniture was tiny. It was like there was primary school furniture. So I would sit on these primary school size chair, drinking from toy cups that were in the building with this women. And the women were so hospitable, despite hunger, despite what they had, despite the fact that people were hungry. But it's inherent in part of being Middle Eastern is this hospitality. And the other thing I was going to say was, forgive my terrible pronunciation, but Yannis, there's a Greek word, philoxenia, but the notion of being hospitable to the stranger as a very Greek cultural thing, but what that also does is the stranger remain. This is something that Rachael has written about, but the stranger remains other. So it's a process of hospitality, but it's also a process of saying we belong, like you were saying about the guest-host relationship. So I think that's a problem with humanitarianism more generally, because in the camps, certainly, and when I was speaking with people in the squats, they said we would rather live here in the squat than in the camp. Because in the camp, we have to be grateful. We have to queue up for, in one man's words, he said, when I first got to the camp he was actually on Chios. Mm-hmm. He said, when I first got to Chios, I thought that the only food that Europeans ate was watery spaghetti and tasteless watery tomato sauce, because that's just what we ate. And I thought, this, surely they don't eat this every day. But and one woman said to me in the squat, I would rather live here in the squat where I can live like a peasant. That was the word she used. I'm much happier to live like a peasant if I can cook for my own family, then I still have my job. So I think autonomy, this is something that humanitarianism gets really badly wrong, that part of home, part of respect, part of self-respect, part of surviving is autonomy over when you go to bed, over what you eat, over, you know, even if you're very poor, if you have some autonomy, you can continue. And there's no one that teaches us that lesson, as well as the Middle Eastern and Asian people on the move. I agree with you entirely, Yannis, that I don't like the word migrant, because people are architects and doctors and all sorts, like you say. Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. Perhaps I would like to ask if Rui has something to add on it, but before, I would like also to add something, because Rui, you said, well, Yannis now he was giving a little bit more detail about his experience that made him speak about the guest that turned it into a host, about his act of sharing the bread as a connection. And I wrote here something that you said that I think that it's a very important point, not only about this situation, but that we are speaking now, but even politically. You said that when we were speaking about Cambedo, you said that we cannot communicate with each other, but we can share something somehow. And this, it seems that it's a kind of very important key, even in this all these conflicts that we are seeing now in this in our world. I think this is something, a comprehension that it's very important to have in mind. So I just would like to give you the word, but with this idea in mind.
Yes, so that was not in Cambedo, that was actually in Resnica, in Croatia. Yes. Anja Mamula, this woman who visited the ruins of the house where she was born as a refugee. Just adding to the discussion about the migrants, the terminology and so on. Yeah, I also agree with both of you. I mean, we should not use the word migrants. And people, when I'm looking at these older stories, people also don't use the word migrants, right? They borrow it from the media, or in Galicia, in the north of Portugal, they use the word to describe these older realities. They use the word fugidos, which is like runaways, and they use the word refugees, both in Portugal or in Croatia. So these other layers, they come with the media, and they come with this, enforced hospitality that comes with the state and comes with the authorities, and so on. I think it's so what the Anja Mamula said in Croatia. I mean, I shaped it that way, but she was basically essentially describing her experience of encountering these migrants. She spends part of her time outside of the village, and then when she comes to the village, she encounters these people in the village, right, as they are walking across the village. And they cannot communicate. She's by herself a lot of the time, and she encounters these people. They come to her door and so on, and so, or sometimes they don't come to her door, and she has the initiative of meeting them and so on. And she said that they cannot communicate, so they don't understand each other's language somehow. And this is something quite interesting. They would exchange some ideas about war. So they would say boom boom. Trying to describe bombs falling, and something that she would, of course, recognize, and she could relate to her own experience, and an experience that resonates not only the Second World War, which is what we were dealing with, but also the wars in the 1990s, the fragmentation, the dissolution of former Yugoslavia. So there are multiple layers here that make people, of course, relate to the experience of these people on the move, as Yannis was describing. And of course, she doesn't even think about it. She runs to the house, she brings the food and clothing and so on that she has, and that's it. And this, as Yannis was saying, this is probably an example of this radical solidarity, even if it is not considered as such, right? Because this woman, obviously, she does not expect anything from those who are walking, and she doesn't even know what they are up to, where they are going. She eventually wonders because she listens to many stories on the media, and that make her afraid because the stories on the media are always about migrants who do wrong things, right? And of course, this resonates a lot locally, and this reflects on how people deal with it locally. And there are tensions that emerge out of these TV, state, global humanitarian narratives, and the narratives that emerge out of the village and people's experience. So these alternative visions of what hospitality should be, this is what we should, or this is what Angie calls the emerging or re-emerging forms of hospitality. This communal, more individual-like approaches that reflect an insatisfaction with the ways in which the state and the authorities and the NGOs deal with people on the move. So they are on their own, unsatisfied, and they decide to take the initiative to do something. And of course, it happens at the individual level, like this woman and Yamamura, and it happens, with broader groups, larger groups, collectives in the urban centers and even in the rural areas that somehow organize themselves to provide support for the people on the move. By the way, so one of the links that you will find on the website is actually the link to one of these small NGOs that operate locally and provide support for people in this region, the border region of Croatia, Serbia, and Bosnia, that they are stuck there many times because they are pushed back by the Croatian authorities. Croatia, some of you probably remember, is on the border of the EU, as Greece is, with Turkey. Croatia is also on the border because Bosnia and Serbia, they are not part of the EU. So a lot of the pushbacks happen on that border area, which is not quite far from Dresnica. And the local community, they are aware of this, right? So they know what is going on, and they know what their intervention may be in this more globalized context, let's say.
Time goes very fast, so we have more or less 12 minutes. So I think that perhaps I will. I imagine that you have also things that you would like to address from the intervention from your interventions. But I have here two questions. They are somehow similar, or they belong to the same family. So I think that I will just put them the two now, and then I'll just let you comment on it. So one is from Katina Lilios, and she says, "Thank you, Rachael, Yannis, and Rui, for a thought-provoking presentation of your important and ethically informed projects and interventions on hospitality, or in some cases, hostile hospitality. What skills and academic training do you think are critical to the work of contemporary archaeology? How did you gain these skills? What changes to academic programs, says anthropology departments in the United States, for instance, would be needed to provide this training?" And then there is another question that came from Sophia Lovegrove, and Sophia says, she starts by saying, "Such inspiring work. Thank you to the speakers and the organizers for this fantastic event. I would like to ask the speakers how they negotiate their positionality of advantage as members of the national groups that exclude others, whose material cultures are the focus of their research." I think that somehow these two interventions, they touch a similar field. So I just leave here for you to comment.
Rachel, would you like to start from the question of for contemporary archaeology, since you presented us a kind of nice overview of the field?
Yeah, I can. I suppose I was actually going to say you should probably tell people how to train because I'm a complete accident. Because I actually was I was a journalist first and an activist in community rabble-rouser in Bristol. My skills as a journalist I still use because I think identifying narrative, well, a lot of what I do involves anthropological ethnographic questioning. So skills as a journalist are also useful because you have and Yannis, it was lovely to hear about you going through a hole in a fence, because that's what we have to do if we want to do these sorts of if we want to work in this sort of area. We have to be unafraid of going through holes in fences, and you have to do it, and you may well get into trouble with your university. But I think the skills are really volunteering. I don't know how old the person who asked that question is or what career stage they're at, but I think volunteering and having a really good sense of what part of humanity inspires you, and also there are lots of really good free activist training type things. There's loads online at the moment about how to be an effective activist, even though COVID has sort of forced us all to sit, in my case, under my stairs for a year. Well, reading about reading around the sort of area that you're fascinated by, and making contacts with people who can tell you about it is probably the best advice I could give. And then the second one about positionality is a really important question about how do you negotiate the power. There is always a power tension, if you like, between the fact that, and I really experienced this when I was working with homeless people in Bristol, that I experienced it also with refugees, that there comes a point at the end of fieldwork where however immersed you are, however volunteering in a kitchen or sweeping a floor or walking for miles. In one case, there was a woman who said, I just need a baby carrier. I just need a baby sling or a pushchair because I can't walk to all the meetings carrying my 2-year-old. And so I went and found her, I went and bought her a pushchair. And so you find yourself, in Jumbo one afternoon thinking, what? This isn't really part of my fieldwork. But actually that's, I think you have to negotiate the fact that however much you immerse yourself, however kind you are, however faithful you are to people's narratives, at the end of the day, you, the researcher, can go home. You can go home, you can use your passport and fly back to home. You can go home to your hotel. You can, you're safe and secure, and you have documentation, and you're not in the same position as the people. So that, I don't really know how you negotiate it. I sometimes, if I'm completely honest, I sometimes just feel completely exhausted by it. I'll go, when I'm in Athens, I am lucky that there's a really nice, tiny but very nice little flat, kind of very close to the 1929 steps. And I just sit on the balcony and kind of decompress for 2 hours by staring at the lights of Athens, and thinking, I don't know how I would cope if I was in their position. And I also journal a lot. So I write in order to not feel traumatized, actually, because you soak up so many stories. And Yannis, your point about, I think that was really clear, that demonstration, that the point you made about the person's story that was just blowing around in the ruins of Morya. When you think about how GDPR, like the data protection, is such a huge thing now, and so to just leave those people's stuff, their stories, their details floating around says everything about how there's no respect at all. It doesn't matter. I've gone off tack, but the negotiating the power thing, it's very tricky, because ultimately, the three of us will write books and get promotions and work in universities, and some of the people that we couldn't do this work without their stories, without their objects, their narratives. What happens to them? So I think that's where I feel like the way that I can best negotiate that is to continue to bang the drum and try and raise money for organizations, and continue to expose the ways in which governments are lying. And it might not meet, I think I'm probably not going to end up in a management position at Oxford because I'm quite mouthy, but that suits me. That's fine.
Yeah. Can I just thank you, Rachael? That was wonderful. Can I just add one or two very quick points? The question first was by our good friend and colleague, Katina Lilios. Katina is a professor of anthropology and archaeology, specialist in Portuguese archaeology. And also, she's a chair of her department right now, chair of the Department of Anthropology. So I guess she's also thinking about various ways of incorporating this into the curriculum of the department, possibly. And I would agree with the points that Rachael expressed. I think we as archaeologists, with our detailed and sustained attention to the materiality of the world, are actually already well trained to also experience and record and study the contemporary world. Because of that kind of, even, as some of you may know, I studied the Neolithic and the Bronze Age. I've spent, hours and hours and hours on one single little Neolithic figurine, but these skills have actually gave me that ability to stare at the razor wire for hours and try to understand how it works for the people who are there. Right? It's a razor wire, but it's much more than that, and you can write a whole essay on it. So that's my first point. The second is that in the US context, because of the four-field anthropology scheme, departments are actually very well placed to develop contemporary archaeology, because many students are also trained in ethnography. They are trained in various kind of oral history or oral kind of narratives, methods and skills. So they can actually do it, I think, much better than in some of the old world departments, where archaeology is much more focused as a professionalized discipline, towards the past as opposed to the present. I think that, my own work on archaeological ethnography around archaeological sites also helped me a lot, but it also requires, I guess, a broader concern and understanding about the issues at stake today in the world, about the politics of the present. And I don't think that we can do contemporary archaeology with a kind of an objectifying lens, with an idea that we are studying the present from a disinterested, objectified point of view. As I think all of us on this panel agree, we have to take a position, we have to take a stance, we have to be sometimes unpopular, clash, with our administrators or, the people in power, because these things are actually about, have an impact on people's lives. Finally, on the issue of positionality, something very brief. At the end of the day, our work as researchers needs to take second place compared to the responsibility towards the people we're working with. And very often, all of us are found ourselves in a situation where we have to abandon what we're doing in terms of research. We have to stop taking notes or taking photos or recording things if something much more important and vital concerning some of this is life, even livelihood and personal kind of routines, like making food or dealing with an authority or something needs to happen. So at that moment, we stop being researchers and being actually the people who are more of an activist there. And sometimes also it involves us disobeying the authorities, ignoring the rule that says no photos. When it is important to witness, it is important to record something that may actually expose a violation of respect, dignity in people's lives. Very briefly, I don't know whether Rui wants to continue.
I don't know if I can still add, do we still have time so I can add a comment? Yeah,
yes.
So about, thank you for the wonderful questions. Regarding the skills about the archaeologist training to deal with this kind of reality, this kind of world, I think, Rachael and Yannis already said what was important. I think I would like to add just another layer because some of the people listening to us are in continental Europe, or more specifically in Portugal, and it's important. Training, archaeological training works in a very different way. It's more historically oriented than anthropological, as it happens in the Americas. So it is important to think that as archaeologists, even if we are trained to work as a prehistoric archaeologist or a classical archaeologist, we have all the skills, the technical skills already to do any kind of work that has to do with contemporary archaeology. What we have to do is to find the right questions and to be committed to the right issues as we move forward in the work of contemporary archaeology. And in this case, there is something that is really important, and sometimes it's lacking in the way archaeologists are trained in continental Europe, which is the political component of our work. So we grow up, let's say, we mature as archaeologists thinking that it is possible to be objective, to be politically objective as we are doing our work, regardless of the time period or the context. This is not true, and of course it's even less true in the case of contemporary archaeology. So I think it's really an important thing that educators, teachers, professors should think of as they are training the students, is to consider the political dimensions of the work that archaeologists do, and somehow provide notions of how archaeologists can engage with politics in the contemporary period, not only as they are doing contemporary archaeology or archaeology of the recent past, but any kind of archaeology. This is something quite important that I think is important to insist on.
Okay. I would like, if you agree, I have two questions that I would like to put, and then we'll finish because we are at 6 o'clock. But as our audience still, they give us these two questions. One of them, I'm not sure if you are in the position to answer them, and the others, it connects with what you just said, Rui, about this idea of objectivity or versus political position also. So I'm just opening here the chat. So the one that I'm not sure if you are in the position of answering it, it's from someone that I imagine that it's not a name, but he or she identifies herself as DJ Metalex. Why doesn't the Greek government want its children to get an education? Also, what is the plan for the generations of children born in Greece of refugee status? I'll just leave it here if you have any key on this. And another question that it's the last question, by Lucinda Canelas. While doing this kind of work as scientists, do you find somehow a lack of emotional distance from your subject? Is that lack of distance a plus, an advantage, or mainly a difficulty? I think that this somehow relates with what you just said, Rui. So I just leave this question.
I can just reply to this one before you guys move to Greece. I think this is not really. I think it's the wrong way of putting things. I mean, there is no way we can distance ever ourselves from anything we do emotionally or effectively. Either as archaeologists or scientists or journalists, it doesn't really matter. There are a series of ethical rules that we may abide for as we are working, but that does not really mean that we are moving away from the person we are, our backgrounds and our experience, our lived experience, and our political engagement with the world in general. So that there is it's really a myth to pretend. I mean, it's a problematic to pretend that we can disconnect ourselves from all of this. As we are doing this kind of work, as I start reading the work by that Yannis is doing, for example, and other colleagues were doing around the world, as I was concerned, I was thinking about other issues. I was doing my PhD and so on about different parts of the world. I could not really disconnect from these discussions that colleagues were already having a couple of years back, because in my family history there are stories of forced displacement and exile and so on, that of course always coming back to my mind as you hear about these stories and these experiences. So part of my reaction and part of my engagement with these stories comes from this really intimate position that I carry with myself, and of course I will never be able to move on from that, right? And this is probably going back to the question of positionality. Sometimes it's also problematic to think of ourselves as someone that is, as a scientist that are outside of the reality that we study, or away from the subject that we study. I think we cannot really move ourselves from this context, right? And we cannot really step back. I think we should always make an effort to connect ourselves to this reality, not just to think of ourselves as someone, okay, we are in a privileged context, we have our very comfortable ways of living, and eventually we engage politically with this reality. But as we are doing that, we have to make an effort in thinking ourselves like intimately to what is happening. I do that thinking about my own history as as being part of a family or a community where these experiences also happen. So it makes me think about in which way can I make sense of the present times, of what is happening around me through my own lived experience.
Yannis or Rachael, I don't.
Rachael, would you like to start, or shall I?
I think you should answer the Greek question.
Yeah. I mean, I will say one or two things about Greece and then broadening that, because I don't think that's the matter for one country.
No.
The situation with education of people who are on the move in Greece is extremely diverse and complicated. So the person who asked the question asked about government initiatives. And it is true, as I said also, that on certain contexts, like for example in Lesbos, the people who used to live in Morya, none of them want education because there was no organized provision by the state to do it. But there were, as I said, many attempts by people who are living there themselves, many migrating people, and there were also attempts by smaller NGOs. In other places within Lesbos, for example, in other camps that were operated by the municipality, the Karatepe camp, or solidarity camps like the Pikpa camp, which closed down by this government, had actually provision for education. And the kids there were going to school, were going to the public schools of Greece, as every other kid in Greece. So it varies a lot. But I want to say one thing about government versus other actors. This government is a xenophobic government. Many other governments in Europe right now are extremely xenophobic. I think there are many other social actors that intervene in this process, and that's the positive and the optimistic thing. So despite the fact that the government may not actually provide for the education of these kids, there are initiatives that cater towards that aim. And that's important. As to why is this happening? Well, it's happening because nationalism is still an organizing principle for for almost every country around the world. And in many cases, like the case of Global North, many countries in Europe and in the US, these countries, the elites from these countries, cannot come to terms with their own history, which is a history of colonization, as we know, and history of white supremacy. That's why at the beginning I suggested to Liana the title, The Return of the Colonized, to show that what we're experiencing today is the latest episode in the very long history of colonization of the earth by the Global North. And what people call migration crisis, we know it is in fact not a migration crisis, it is a reception crisis. It is a crisis of these countries to receive these people and to understand that they are coming here because we are there. And I think that kind of issue explains the xenophobic attitudes of many nation states in Europe and of the European Union as a whole. I mean, I mentioned briefly the new Asylum Pact. I don't know whether you have seen it. It's already under discussion amongst many agents and actors within the European Union, but it evokes the sense of solidarity. And you would think, great, they have actually started doing something. And then you read and it says, solidarity amongst nation states, so we can actually spread the cost and the burden. So, this is in fact, how to reallocate sources around the European Union so that no single country can carry the burden. It also provides for sponsorship for deportations, right? One way of actually sharing the burden is to sponsor to send somebody back to a country like Afghanistan, for example, or in Kabul, where there are bombs every day and people dying like that. So despite the rhetoric, and even if you see the videos by the European Commissioner announcing this plan, she evoked Morya and said, no more Moryas. And yet, if you go now to Lesbos and see the new Morya, Morya 2 is in fact worse than Morya 1, because it's an extremely regulated space next to the water, next to the sea, and does not even provide for what Morya had, which is a hinterland and a landscape where people could actually go out and gather firewood and cook. That is no longer possible in the new Morya. So the new Morya, Morya 2, is worse than Morya 1. So that's a long answer to say that there is a background which is historical and social and political that results in specific policies today, but thankfully there's also resistance. And of course, above all, the resistance of migrating people themselves. They do continue the journey. And in fact, despite the stories of deportation and pushbacks, many people, perhaps the majority, eventually succeed continuing the journey. They may try several times, as Rachael also said, they may try time and again to actually cross borders and continue, and may go through the long way to actually reach a country, but many of them continue. And that's, I think, the positive thing. So that's experience, that phenomenon reshapes our world as we speak. And it's changing gradually, including the countries of the Global North.
Rachael?
Yannis did a really great job of explaining it's tricky with schooling in Greece, and Yannis did a good job of explaining why. There were some squats where children were going to school, and City Plaza, before that closed, the children, they went to school, but then Syriza was in power, so it was different. And certainly many of the squats have volunteer teachers. So there's a guy who will get refugee children or the children of people on the move through so up to kind of GCSE maths level, and he can't take them through exams, but at least those children are still learning. So there are alternatives. But I think something as an outsider myself in Greece that I found really fascinating was when I was working with Our House, I discovered that they're the people who were raising money through selling photographs, through crowdfunders, through asking on Facebook, just saying, please, can we have some money? and then they would rent apartments in Athens and go to the parks and literally, say to homeless, a lot of West Africa, when I was there in 2019, a lot of West African sort of Congolese women and children, but also Afghan women and children, and they just went to the parks and said, you're homeless here, you have nowhere to go, you have a small baby, or you're pregnant, or you have young children, come with us, we have a flat, you can only have it for 6 weeks or so, but it will just give you somewhere to be able to have a hot shower, to gather your thoughts, and then it gives you a base where you can go around and see if you can get official help, if that makes sense, which seemed like a good thing to me. And then I established that they were not incorporated in any sense. And I said to the guy who was running it, who's an Iranian man, and I said, are you not worried that you could be perceived to be a trafficker or a pimp? And he said, oh, you Europeans, you're obsessed with paperwork. And I said, but you have nothing to show that you're not a trafficker. I mean, I know he's not, but if he was caught doing this, he could be in a lot of danger. And he said to me, he said, well, what are you saying? You saying it's more ethical to leave women and children at risk, homeless in the park, where they're at risk of, danger, physical danger, of rape. And I said, well, it's dangerous for you because you're not, you haven't got the right paperwork. And he said, Europeans, of course it's less ethical to leave them on the streets. And actually, it's true. Actually, it is true that what kind of a society are we if we leave women and children who've fled for their lives? Some of them, experienced the most horrific conflict. Many of them are pregnant through rape. And we leave them out in the park. So actually, I think that it comes back to positionality again, where, as an outsider in Greece, I would sometimes think this is really inhospitable and not at all how I, as a white person, am greeted in Greece. I don't experience the racism that some of the people I'm working with did. And that's the same here as well. So I'm not saying that's a Greek thing. That's definitely, as Yannis was saying, it's a worldwide thing, sadly, but everyone seems to have shifted to the right. But I do think that, that's where the activism comes in. That's where I sort of sat and I was like, oh, should I keep documenting these places? Or, what's the ethically right thing to do? And I sort of muddled over it for a few days and thought, yes, I will. And so I went back at Christmas and I spent my children were with their dad last Christmas. So I didn't want to be, I just wanted to be somewhere else, not having Christmas. So I went to Athens and spent 2 weeks, finding mattresses and heaters and blankets and distracting myself by trying to be useful.
Well, thank you very much. I think we already are going, it's 6:18, so we went over our time, but it's very good. I think that to finish I'm going back also to this issue of positionality, because Rachael said during our presentation that you said something that I think it's important, that even if it's not what it's going to save everything, I think it's very important to keep this in mind. You said that archaeology, it's also a way of acknowledge those realities, and of not letting it go and not allowing it to disappear. So I think this is also an important contribution somehow. So thank you very much for your interventions. Now we'll need to stop. And thank you also to everyone who are on the other side.
Yeah, thank you very much. And
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, it was great.